Good day and welcome. My name is Stefan Nicolo, and I am a proud advisory board member of Monument Lab. Welcome to the second day of the second annual Monument Lab Town Hall. We are connecting from all over today, across time zones and regions. I'm reaching you from New York City, which is located on the ancestral lands of the Lenape Nations. Next week, as we prepare to acknowledge Indigenous Peoples Day on Monday, we should share this acknowledgement as a call to honor their deep connections to the land and the ongoing struggle for greater forms of justice and care for Indigenous, as well as Black and Brown, and other communities central to the stories of this place. This year's theme of the Town Hall, Shaping the Past, picks up on the question of legacies of history and ways we can look to art, memory, and education as pathways to repair. Today's Monument Lab Town Hall kicks off the project of the same name, Shaping the Past, which is a partnership between Monument Lab, the Goethe Institute, and the German Federal Agency for Civic Education, or the BPB. The project facilitates a transnational exchange program, bringing artists and activists together in dialogue to highlight ongoing critical memory interventions in sites and spaces across North America and Germany. Yesterday, if you were tuned in, you heard moving and profound panels, curating memory and justice, and art and activism, shaping the public sphere. If you were not tuned in, don't worry. All programs were recorded and available on YouTube, Facebook, and soon the Monument Lab and Goethe pages. Right now, please take out your phones and follow us on social media at monument_lab and at Goethe, spelled Goethe DC, and BPB_DE. Today, we have our two panels, Memory, Trauma, and Transformation, and Confronting Art and History. Between these two panels, you will see a special video program featuring the work of the 2020 Monument Lab Transnational Fellows. On Zoom, you can hear today's proceedings in English, Spanish, German, and German. You can also find more on the fellows, their videos, and more on Monument Labs and the Goethe Institute's North America websites. Before proceeding with the town hall, we want to thank our supporters, the Serdna Foundation, the Center for Public Art and Space at the University of Pennsylvania Weitzman School of Design, as well as partners SLOT, the Institute for Contemporary Art, Philadelphia, 1014, and the Thomas Mann House. Monument Lab also wishes to thank our presenting partners, Goethe and BPB. Thanks so much. Now, we will hear a video greeting from our colleague, Thomas Kruger, President of the Federal Agency for Civic Agency in Germany and the BPB.
Dear speakers and moderators, dear fellows, memory workers of the world, I am delighted to welcome you to the second day of the Monument Labs Town Hall. Just a few days ago, the 3rd of October marked 30 years of German reunification. It reminded me of the ensuing changes to the memory landscape in my native eastern part of Berlin. Within a few years, many streets were no longer named after communists and monuments were removed. The most famous example was a 19-meter statue, a high statue of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, now stored among other dismantled monuments in the far west of Berlin. While Lenin was simply erased, another monument structure from the communist era in East Germany has a more twisted story to tell about shaping the past. The so-called Palace of the Republic had been built on the site of Prussian King's Palace in ruins since World War II. After reunification, the GDR's palace was dismantled and is now replaced by a reconstruction of the Prussian palace. If you think it is questionable enough to rebuild the boastful symbol of a monarchy overcome 1 century ago, here comes the icing on the cake. This building, inseparable from Germany's colonial and imperialist past, will now be used to showcase artworks from non-Western countries, many of which were taken by force. Germany has gained respect for its ways of dealing with the atrocities of National Socialism. Yet, as the example of Berlin's palace shows, there is a long way to go and many questions are the same around the world. How do we deal with monuments that worship oppressive, erase, and representatives? If we erase them, how do we replace them? How do different layers of history relate to each other and to our present and future? How can memory become and remain vivid with the help of scholars, artists, and grassroots initiatives? And last but not least, how do we as civil societies tackle racist, sexist, colonial and classist legacies transnationally? Shaping the Past was designed to develop new approaches and networks to answer these questions. The Federal Agency for Civic Education is proud to be a part of this project, and I would like to thank our partners at Monument Lab, the Goethe Institute, and our fellows for their hard and inspiring work. I am convinced that this conference and the upcoming activities will be valuable steps towards a more critical, creative, and just way of dealing with the past and shaping a better future. Thank you.
Thank you, Tomas. And to all the staff and the team at the BPB, a big thank you. We're ready to begin day 2 of the town hall. Now introducing the moderator of our first panel, Sue Mobley, Senior Research Scholar at Monument Lab. Sue is based in New Orleans and is a longtime friend, collaborator, and now we are thrilled to share Sue is an official member of the Monument Lab team. Welcome, Sue. Sue will be helping direct the National Monument Audit and the Field Offices Initiative, supported through our partnership with the Mellon Foundation announced earlier this week. Sue will be moderating the first panel, Memory, Trauma, and Transformation, with our friends Daniela and Mabel. Over to you, Sue.
Good morning, everyone. There we go. And good morning to Mabel and Daniela. I'm so glad to have had the chance to talk to both of you earlier this week and to really think about the work you're doing and thinking about the questions today. The two of you approach the subject of memory from very, very different fields, perspectives, and backgrounds. Interestingly, given these differences, each of your work evokes shared central themes in the creation of memory: agency, freedom, power. How did you arrive at the work you've undertaken? And when and how did those themes emerge for you in that work?
You should go first.
I'll start with that question. And I just want to thank Monument Lab and the Goethe for putting on what I think is a really important conversation and a timely conversation for how we think about our built environment and the thematics that draw us together as different publics and more importantly, as humans. I think my interest in the question of memory cannot be disconnected from history. I'm both a cultural historian and an architect by training. And as I moved around my built environment, I would see things and start to think about where did they come from? How long have they been there? And so the question of sort of time and space has always been important to me. But maybe a dimension that was sometimes missing was understanding my own cultural history as an African American and wanting to know more about the histories of the places that I recall as a child. And becoming a student of architecture, hearing about all these grand Italian palazzos and English countryside homes, and having gone to UVA, just the campus itself, but not really hearing a dimension of, what it meant for peoples of African descent to be in those places, knowing that there is clearly a history there. And so that really sparked my curiosity about what are the stories that needed to be told about these places and about people.
So it's very interesting that Mabel is mentioning how historical events prompted her. For me, it was actually thinking about the future. And it starts with fear, this emotion that I felt is very debilitating and limiting our freedom. And fear arises from our history, as Mabel said. So it's our memories, and it's what we choose to remember. And based on these memories, we try to predict what is going to happen. So if we retrieve certain types of memories that makes us afraid, it will gravely determine how we act. So I got interested in emotional memories, how emotional memories are formed, why are they so strong, why do we retrieve them, why is it so hard to modify them? And through this lens, I think it shapes dramatically our well-being and our freedom. It very much limits what we're going to do because it projects about what we think is going to happen in the future.
In our earlier conversation, Daniela, you discussed memory as dialogic, meaning that we have a relationship with memory, even our own, that's one of continual revision. And Mabel, you framed it in terms of literally remembering, reassembling pieces of memory into a working hypothesis of the past. Why is this such an important process? How does it serve us? Personally, socially, how does it misserve us?
From a scientific perspective, it's very interesting. There's been a dramatic shift in how we view memory in the last few decades. We used to think of memory as a one-time process that is formed through the consolidation of new information, by which it turns into a memory that we retrieve. And we thought that we retrieved the same thing again and again. But then a few decades ago, there has been seminal findings in neurobiology that show that when a memory is retrieved in the brain, it actually returns to something very similar to a new memory, and it has to be restored again. And this is a window of opportunity for change. I think the listeners who have experience in clinical psychology would probably say, well, we knew that, and every therapy pretty much deals with modifying the memories you retrieve. But I think the dramatic event was that finally there was a biological basis for it. And this is how neurobiology and clinical psychology merged. It was quite interesting to see how they evolved separately and arrived at the same conclusion. So this prompted the question of why would nature allow such a process to make memories vulnerable? Why would they change? If we think about them as recordings, we actually want the recording to be very accurate. And this is why it changed how we think about the function of memory. Instead of a recording of our past, it's more about understanding the present and predicting the future. So an act of retrieval is really an act of reconstruction. And the way we reconstruct it is much affected by the present information. And it's a good thing because we do need to incorporate novel information to our memories. Otherwise, we will be like recordings of our past experience. And many experiences, of course, are not relevant anymore. We need to understand them better based on the current context. So in this sense, the reconstruction of memory is adaptive and valuable for our well-being.
Yeah, no, I really like exactly what you're saying, Daniela, about this idea of retrieval, of like going back and bringing back, right? And it's amazing that it's actually now that we, the work that you do, like we now understand that as a biological process, because that's so important. It's so foundational to recognition, right? Like we recognize, so like, a word, or like how you are in the world. And it seems so foundational for knowing who you are, and also knowing where you are, like the sense of belonging. And so for me, as somebody who's coming out of architecture and also as a historian, that seems so fundamental. I always like to think about Michel Roth-Trio. I often say this to students, where he says, there is what happened, and then there is what is said to have happened. And those are not the same thing. And so that process of retrieval is also operative on these kind of larger, shall we say, social scales, right? Of things like history. But they also are operative on an individual level, I think with individuals. And I think the three of us also talked about this idea, and the way Sue put it, of remember, right? So that everything is in peace, and it's about putting it back together, remembering. And that's what Toni Morrison describes it as. And it gets sticky with other things that are associated with it. So it's never a pure ability to remember, although I believe there are people who can do that, who never forget, because forgetting is also part of the process.
Take up that theme of forgetting and remembering on the social scale, on the collective scale, in terms of history, it seems important to then talk about power. Though, of course, power relationships are functioning at every scale of memory, between adults and children, between majorities and minorities, between governments and their peoples, between the colonizing and those they colonize. And those power dynamics are part of what helps to define what we're allowed to remember, what we're discouraged from remembering, what we're coerced into remembering differently. What's the work for each of you, for all of us, and the risk of expressing and retrieving dissenting memories? How does that manifest? How can it? And why does it cause resistance? What can we do to ease or lessen that friction?
I mean, I guess, and I'd be curious what Daniela would say about something like this, but, there have been, people who kind of write about collective memory, right, which engages this question of the social, and how the experience is individual, but also the languages, the way in which we even kind of code it with associations in the mind, which isn't perfect, is still nonetheless laced with a kind of social structure, right? That brings us language, is a way of understanding, right? Of knowing, or decoding even memories and what they mean. And that's complicated because, we are, we're remembering through all of these other kinds of associations with things, and that is very much embedded in these kind of social contexts in which we are called to recollect, or certainly in the way I think about it, is that environments are full of triggers. There's sounds, there's sights, there's smells, there And that is constantly, and then once we understand that, then there are ways of embedding things that are permanent that then lead to associations and memories. So, short term, long term, I think it's very social. And that therefore makes it, an interesting means by which power can then be constructed. And I think more certainly could be said about that.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing how we use exactly the same terms to describe the large scale and the very personal individual scale. It's interesting to think that we actually don't really know why we retrieve certain things. It's still a mystery in terms of the brain, how the retrieval itself comes about. But we do know, as Mabel said, that triggers are essential. Memories become associated with multiple cues. And this is why the environment has extreme power over our memories in terms of what will be triggered. And it also can induce a certain kind of a habit of what we retrieve in a certain situation, like an association that we kind of reflexively do. But we also can recall memories willingly, when we search our past, when we want to remember something. I'm kind of collecting all sorts of theories that try to explain why we remember. Another idea is that we remember what is relevant to us, to our personality, such that we will be a coherent person at that moment, or something that will validate or assure or match how we perceive ourselves. So it's in the service of something that is personally relevant. So if you take all of these as a collective, you can see that there are a lot of influences on what we remember, but at the same time, we have some agency. So I think there's a fine balance between what the past is dictating and what we choose the past to be and what we choose to be now. So the way we retrieve things tells us a lot about our present preferences and what we want to be, or what we are forced or induced to remember. The extreme cases are, of course, traumatic memories. That is a process that is still not understood, why we re-experience memories, or in terms of trauma, there's this repeated re-experiencing without control, like intrusive memories that we wish we wouldn't remember. But in a way, we also have that at a very benign level. On a daily basis, we do have our own kind of less traumatic memories that we retrieve. So it maybe rides on that natural process. But I think if we listen and observe the way we use triggers, the way we choose to induce memories will tell us a lot about processes that are happening to us at the individual level and at the social level.
Yeah, I just want to add, one of my favorite movies, I don't know if either of you have seen this, it was an early Christopher Nolan movie called Memento.
Sure.
Yeah, and the way he structures narrative, I find fascinating. I've actually had students draw the narrative because, narrative is supposedly flowing in time forward, but this is kind of a very interesting kind of backward narrative. And the character has this problem with short-term memory. And it goes through like all of the pneumatic devices that he's trying to use, the piece of paper, the map, then he turns to his body because he can't, he figures, well, if it's on my body, it's always with me. And it's fascinating, for me as a movie, it points to how much we rely on memory, but are so not aware of how it structures our engagement. And in his case, he becomes exploited by others who recognize he doesn't have this ability, right? And so they believe they have the power relation, right? That they can dominate him and manipulate him. But in the end, which I won't give the end of the movie, we realize, oh, wait, he has another nefarious agenda. But I just think it's a remarkable kind of meditation on the power of the ability to remember and its entanglements in social relations and also things like the law and morality. And like all of these things are dependent upon it. But I will, again, the question of the environment, what I've always admired about that movie is the fact that Christopher Nolan films it in like nowhere. You don't know where this is. It could be anywhere. It's so unremarkable and unmemorable as a place, which I think is part of what he's trying to cue us into, you know, around the everyday or around the generic landscape, right, of American cities. So if you haven't seen it, I think it's a remarkable film in that regard. I think the best Christopher Nolan film, in fact.
Yeah, it is a great movie. I like the idea of you know, forward narrative and backward narrative. I think we can take it even one step further, such that every kind of, if you just like you know, think about it philosophically for a second, in a way it can be that every moment is a re-scrambling of that narrative, and then you reconstruct it. So it doesn't even have this exact continuation from moment to moment, as long as the current moment is coherent. This is, I think, how I tend to view memory now, that what we retrieve now falls into a coherent picture that tells us something about the past and the future. But in the next moment, it can actually be very different. We just wouldn't be completely aware of it because we live in that narrative at the moment. Maybe that's another, you know, idea for a movie for Christopher Nolan.
But I wonder, I mean, just to keep riffing on this, Sue, just a little bit, you know, like your question about power, which I think is interesting, because that's what I find remarkable about that movie, is the way in which it recognizes that ability to recall can then be manipulated, right? And to think about ways in which, you know, I would just say in the West, like the novel comes into being as this sort of personal narrative of time, of the self being in time, right? So it's intimate, right? At a moment when the concept of the social is also emerging in the West as a kind of agent, right? And that's also at a moment of great colonization, where differences are also kind of being sorted out and defined in particular kinds of hierarchies, class hierarchies, racial hierarchies as well. And so the ability to then both understand the past, control the present, and predict the future, right, as progress is, you know, becomes a kind of power relation, right, that is generative of like civilization, right, with the big C. And so that ability to place in time, not only a person, but people, becomes a locus of great power.
Yeah, I actually had a personal experience with that growing up in Israel. The memory of the Holocaust is extremely dominant at the society level. You know, from first grade onward, you're part of ceremonies as memorial days. There are very certain things you can do. You have to stand silent during the siren. So it's very, very much embedded in your upbringing. And you grow up knowing that something really terrible happened. At the same time, my father, who survived the Holocaust, never, ever talked about it, pretty much to anybody. And it was a mystery to me. It's like, what happened? And coming from school, I would usually assume that something really, really terrible happened. And through a long process and almost in the nick of time, really a few months before he died, finally he talked. Not even directly to me, but we just managed to create a situation of a documentary. So he really spoke to the director next to me, which is a certain bridge. We can also think about creating bridges to convey memories. But when he finally spoke, he talked about very little event, very personal, very intimate. And he said, it's like, why would I even tell that? People would think it's pathetic because. And he said, of course I can tell you about, you know, being shot and, you know, almost dying and all. He almost said like, yeah, sure, I have these, but these are not the important memories. You know, there was specific memories like his mother giving him a sandwich instead of eating it, like really heartbreaking moment, but very, very personal and little. And at that moment, I understood the burden that the survivors have. And also that the function of the collective memory is in a way not for them or less for them. It's really for us. And there's almost a role for creating this horrible, reminding us how horrible it is, because it also helps us distance it from normality and say, yeah, it's something horrible that happened in the past. But talking to him, it was very daily and mundane and horrible in that way. And I felt kind of sorry that a lot of survivors probably couldn't talk because they can't, it's almost like they can't fulfill the expectation of the horribleness. So I think there is a great tension of the societal memory and the personal memory. And we have to ask ourselves what the societal memory serves and who it serves.
I think that's an excellent lead-in to one of our questions from the audience. That question of who it serves and how. So from Anonymous, always a great sign. How can the lived experiences and collective memories of the Black diaspora and the Jewish diaspora inform one another? And importantly, craft a more equitable future memory landscape for all. Mabel and Daniela, you're both uniquely positioned to answer this question from your lived experience and encoded intergenerational traumas vis-a-vis the Holocaust, slavery, racism, and anti-Semitism.
I mean, I guess the question is to craft a more equitable future memory landscape for all. I mean, I would say almost something very similar to Daniela and also kind of what I was beginning to say at the beginning in my own education, my own college education in architecture, like just not knowing my family history. Like my family they just didn't talk, you know, like my grandfather, they just never said this is, we knew where they lived, but they never said, oh, this is where we're from. This is, you know, so you just don't know much about, I just didn't know anything about them. I happened to do a genealogy of the family right before my father passed away. And I knew both sides, and I was able to go into the archive and just sort of piece that together and connect with other genealogists and realize, oh, wait, my family's been here basically, or certainly I know the African descendant side since the Revolutionary War, certainly on one side of the family, and probably the European side of the family have been here since the 17th century in Virginia. And so you kind of then start to see yourself in this historical arc where you were never seen before. And that is, I found it fascinating, but I also found it very disconcerting when you then start to excavate a lot of that past and you realize the violences that are in those stories, you know, just like I think what Danielle was saying about the mundane moments of her father's life, but then those moments of violence, like those are part of these. And so to think about future memory, I've just been thinking, and maybe it's just age, like how do we reckon with those violences that also have produced, you know, what Trilo would say, the silences in the archive, the absences in the landscape. And then can they speak for all? And what does all mean, right? Because this vision, I think, of a, you know, that we have these frameworks that we walk around with, like the notion of the public is all, or that the citizenry is all, you know, it's not, it never was meant to be everyone. And so what that future might look like, I think is going to have to come from, I agree, an understanding of who we are now and the inequalities that we all live with and where they came from in order to understand what that might mean in the future. And I'm trained in architecture, so it's very projective. It's all about the future. But I often see in architecture, it's so utopic because it never wrestles with the moment enough, I think.
Yeah, I can add that I think it's a very important question and a hard question to ask, putting, as Mabel said, putting all these experiences together. Because on the one hand, people do want their experience to be uniquely recognized. You know, they don't want to be in a pool of, or horrible events, right? Or memories, as if it reduces a little bit from each individual memory. So it is a delicate art to weave together multiple events, multiple historical events, and respecting and giving the room for each individual memory's experience. At the same time, there's a high value for bridging. So, for example, I remember this woman who survived the Rwanda genocide, and she reached out to Holocaust survivors because she wanted to know how is it to survive that. She wanted to take from their experience and bring it to the people she knew and was trying to heal. And in this sense, the sharing of experience can be extremely healing, also educational, and create bonds. But at the same time, it is important to acknowledge the specific experience historically and not to pull them together. So that's the challenge, I think. So I think if we create monuments or memorizing tools that reflect this individual uniqueness of the experience, but create places and communication forums, I think in this case, we can weave together this experience and have a shared sense of community and shared past in a way.
That was a really fascinating exchange. Thank you both. That was an incredibly hard question.
That was hard. Go easy on us, people.
I'm going to ask this one, which has a value statement at the front of it. Sarah Diligenti asks, isn't forgiving more important than forgetting? If we forget, we're bound to repeat history in a different way, maybe, but with the same ideology. I'm going to ask that we unpack both of those. The statement of forgiving being more important than forgetting as separate from the idea of forgetting and repeating, and take them as separate concepts. I don't have any easy questions. It's a rough crowd.
I guess I can start on that from the individual perspective, which is going back to the conversations with my father, that I was wondering why he didn't talk so many years with anyone eventually but me and the movie director, is in addition to the mundane events that I described, there was the extremely difficult moment, of losing his sister, his young sister, and these types of events. And I realized that it's actually very hard to live with. Such an enormous pain. And in a way, it is very distant from normality. So it was funny because, many years I'm studying memory and how to modify memories, and the principle of it that you do need to retrieve the memory. As here, let's see, Sarah is mentioning about, you need to remember it in order to live with it and to modify it. But then after talking to my father, I realized that actually suppression is pretty good. It is a healthy mechanism that protects us in a way. The question is, what is the price of suppression? So I think I wouldn't go to the extreme of we really do need to remember everything. I think there is something healthy in certain situation, and depending on the price, I will say it very carefully, that will allow you to just live, at least at the individual level. At the collective level, it's probably different. It's probably more value to remembering, critical value actually, for remembering and living with it, finding a way to forgive. I think forgiveness is extremely important at the individual level from psychological well-being perspective. So it's not really about forgiving others. It's just forgiving, really forgiving that stuff happened, forgiving life, forgiving without someone to forgive. Just forgiving what happened is a very therapeutic process if you're able to reach that point. So both of these processes are important. We just need to see where to implement them, how, and at what price.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, again, these are not easy questions it's been a long week and it's Friday. But I, you know, like Daniela, I will think about it maybe more contextually, particularly around slavery. We recently completed the memorial to enslaved laborers at the University of Virginia. And one of the quotes that's in our historical timeline is by a woman named Isabella Gibbons. And for us, it was a powerful quote to include because it is the only recollection of a community of 4,000 enslaved people that we have in the ways in which we record, like written history. And one of the things she said, we will never forget. We're not going to forget the murder, the beatings, the whippings, the slave collars, the separation of children from their mothers. She's like, we're not going to forget at all. Although I would say probably, you know, she dies in 1890. And by then Jim Crow was in full force. So white supremacy had just rebooted itself, but in this different way. And there was a whole other regime of violence that replaced the violence of slavery, right? So it wasn't like as she forgot. I mean, she's still living with this form of dehumanization. Whether she forgave, I don't know. And I've been curious, there's a photograph of her. We use her eyes actually on the exterior of the memorial in a beautiful piece by the artist Eto Otatigbe. And, you know, her eyes are a kind of a witness for her community. And it comes from a photograph that is in the Boston Public Library collection. And I can't figure out how it ended up there other than the person who owned her, George Rogers Clark, I think, found it at MIT. And he and his wife end up in Boston. So she must have mailed a photograph of her as a teacher to her former owners. So there must have been some understanding to say, look, I am now your equal. And in doing that, maybe that was a sign of forgiveness. I don't know. I don't know whether that was grace in the sense that, you know, that she wanted recognition for her humanity by sending that to her. I mean, I'm speculating that that's why it was in the Boston Public Library, because I couldn't think of because she dies in Charlottesville. So how does it end up in Boston? But I don't know. I mean, I think the question of forgiveness requires a whole other kind of moral plane, I think, in relationship to understanding past wrongs, right? Because you then have to understand the past in order to understand why forgiveness would be a necessary act.
Next hard question. I've read, it's also anonymous, hyper anonymous. I've read news stories and heard anecdotes about how trauma is passed down across generations, either in one's DNA or in other forms of memory. In other words, ancestors experience something traumatic that you would in turn feel an acute effect of in some manner years later. How have you encountered this idea of the transference of trauma specifically, or more generally, in your research?
Yeah, very, very fascinating question. It actually relates to a field of scientific study that really developed in the last few years. It's called epigenetics. So we don't have just genetic inheritance. Epigenetics is the mechanisms that control the expression of genes. So if you can imagine the DNA, you can imagine like little, keepers on it that kind of opens the gate, and this gene will be expressed, or this gene will be expressed. And actually, they're very important determinants of what in our DNA will be active. And it turns out that the wound, where the fetal is developing, and also components that come also from fathers, not only from mothers, all interact in the womb to determine for long term how the baby's DNA will be expressed. So if, for example, the mother or the father underwent extreme stress, and it has been shown actually in animals, in mice that has been stressed, or rats, that if they underwent certain experience, it will be expressed in how the DNA of their offsprings will be expressed later on. So in this sense, you do have epigenetic effects. So not just genetic inheritance. And this means that you could transfer your experience. So it's a very biological, kind of less psychological or sort of holistic explanation, but it's pretty much what it is. Your experiences shape the environment in which the fetus is developing, and it could have effects on how eventually some characteristics of the fetus. So there has been studies on also second generation of Holocaust survivors, and there was some differences in how they experience stress and their kind of stress system, how it was slightly modified and different by the experience of their parents. So this is at the biological level. And of course, at the psychological level, the experiences of our parents certainly shape us. If you grow up with a person that has certain behaviors, you will inherit these, or at least they will have very important effects, not even non-verbal, kind of these overt processes can shape your experience. And in this sense, we also inherit the psychological experiences. And the way our parents look at the world is something that we learn quite deeply from them.
Yeah, I mean, this is not my area of expertise at all, but I think I understand that can be passed down through multiple generations. Like, it's not like just a singular generation, but it could be like 4 or 5 generations down that stress is simply being passed on, which is also environmentally important to think about. If you are living in, for example, in impoverished conditions, right, structural poverty, and it's literally the kind of environmental stressors of polluted air. You've got toxic drinking water. You are you're living crowded areas. You're the ability to simply find just the room to literally kind of breathe, and all of that. Meaning, I'm sure, it has an impact on generation after generation after generation.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's the combination of the environment and our genes that could be passed on.
I think thinking about it in terms of the biological and the environmental, and particularly as I'm receiving updates from folks to my west who are taking their second hurricane in less than a month, and how much trauma I'm seeing manifest in this waiting.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about, post Katrina, right, and people who have been moved by that, who were ripped away from their communities, and then there's just been this sort of, onslaught, right, of kind of catastrophic storms coming out of the Gulf, which have been attributed to climate change, which means they're not going to stop. It's just going to keep coming. And so what's the long-term, impact of that on various communities?
I think in keeping with thinking about that long-term impact and the environmental context, the question from Olivia Myers, How do we construct spaces that tell a new narrative or previously repressed narrative, counter to the primary narratives that existed in a specific site? How do we heal places, landscapes that were strategically planned, used to inflict pain and repress populations through the built environment? And the example that she gives is prominent locations in parks, cities that are the sites of removed Confederate monuments to the lost cause. But I think that that could also be expanded to be the history of ghettos, of redlined communities, of oppressed communities, of refugee camps, of reservations. The spaces that oppress are so much greater than those that are claimed through a monument. How do we heal?
I mean, I think, just the Confederate monuments, as we're learning, while those seem very singular, they're not. I mean, they were part of the Daughters of the Confederacy put up a lot of those. That was a civic association of the wives, daughters, mothers of Confederate soldiers to try to construct a narrative of honor around traitors. I mean, it was a traitorous, they were essentially traitors against the United States, to recuperate a sense of valor of those. And so it's not a singular thing, it's a social, and then it becomes structural, because then municipalities have to agree to that. And then celebrations have to occur, and then those celebrations occur. So it builds up a sort of the narrative of the lost cause as the construction, but it's constructed by multiple institutions. But in the same way, redlining occurs. It's not like somebody says, hey, I want to do this to a neighborhood. It was the collusion of the real estate industry, the banking industry, map makers. Everyone had to participate in order to produce these conditions of structural impoverishment that was designating what was grade A, green, gray, typically white, and what was grade D, which meant you might have had literally on the maps, they will say Mexicans, refugees, Chinese, and then it had a whole separate category for the Negro, right? And so that is planned and it's systemic. And so I think that if we are going to try to make spaces that are healing, we have to have a collective understanding and value care. Like, we have to begin to care for, and that in our society is not valued. Care labor is something that is in fact undervalued. It is the people who maintain things, the people who restore things. These are the care workers in all of its dimension. And so we would have to have a radical rethinking structurally of what that would mean in order to produce that environment. And so I wouldn't say that it's a revolution, because I think that's often patriarchal, and it's sometimes very singular as an ideological model, but I think it would have to be a profound restructuring of what we value in order to produce those conditions. And I think it can be done. I just think we have to be aware and realistic about the scale and scope of what needs to occur.
Yeah, I can completely echo what Mabel just said at the personal level. It works very similarly. If we think about emotional memories similarly to monuments, what they do is when you retrieve them or visit a monument, the question is, how does it make you feel now? The feeling that it elicits now. So if it elicits shame, humiliation, guilt, fear, it's like negative emotions, it means that it's an unhealthy memory. It's not the experience you want to have. So at the personal level, if it's a traumatic memory that makes you feel like that, for example, for a rape victim to feel guilt, or for a veteran that survives an attack and his fellow soldiers died and he feels guilt for the survival guilt and so forth. These are the memories we need to learn to deal with. And the way to do it is to find a place of the memory, to observe it, to separate it from the moment, and give it a room of understanding such that when you retrieve it, it doesn't elicit the negative emotions, but it also is not a gap in your life that you refuse to visit. You could observe it and still maintain your health and the fact that you are in a good place now. And it sounds very similar to monuments, if you have them, and what they create is just humiliation and just reminder of extremely negative events that are not aligned with the way we currently are. There's a problem. And this is how you need to recreate these experiences. Be very attentive to how you memorize, how it makes the society or part of the society feel, and does it really reflect the current situation and how we want to perceive it.
We have a question from Miranda Kyle. Since there is such disparity in collective recall, as is evidenced by crime scene witnesses, perspectives on historical monuments, those with proximity to power usually dictate the manifestations of those memories in the public sphere. Does that make whoever is in power fulfill the unreliable narrator archetype? How would we reach consensus on these collective memories, especially if they are to become public art or shared public spaces?
Oh, I think you're going to put that. I mean, I would just say that I think we just should recognize that what we, that why people might erect a monument or a memorial to something at that moment might be meaningful, but it may not be meaningful later on, or the narrative may change, which is why I think these things are constantly being reevaluated as to their relevancy. But that, that is how, that is how social life evolves, right? It's like the people who are the originalists for the Constitution. The Constitution has to be interpreted as it was at the moment it was written, which is ridiculous. I mean, language change, attitudes change, the nation, that these things are malleable. And so, I would just say the thing, and it's weird because I think the thing about, let's say, monuments or memorials are, in terms of how they mark or try to represent certain meanings, is that these meanings are transcendent, and that's always the way it's going to be. I mean, that is part of the work that they do in public space, and often are enacting, I think, as Miranda points out, it's related to power. Like, who has the power to control the space to be able to mark it is absolutely an act of power. Like, who would have thought Monument Avenue in Richmond would ever come down? And yet it did. I mean, there really was enough momentum, public sentiment. The city's changed that it was just like, we're done with this. And so these things, the monuments are malleable. And I think that is kind of the work of Monument Lab to begin with.
Yeah, monuments are malleable, and also our memories are malleable. I couldn't agree more. It's a very powerful question. Basically, who's in charge? You're asking who's in charge. And I'm actually asking myself that question almost every day. It's like, who's in charge of my memory? And I think in this sense, if we develop a sense of agency over our memories, at least of the experience of memory, it will make a great difference in our understanding of who's in charge. So instead of thinking that the memories are who we are in a deterministic way, it's like, I don't know, I just remember this, it's probably who I am. I would say no. You can observe that memory, like I said earlier, and Sue mentioned that we talked about the fact that we actually need to develop a relationship with our memory. It's not who we are, it's something we interact with, and we can observe, we can have a judgment, and we can have an understanding, and we have an ability to shape it. And I think a similar process is happening at the social level, just like Mabel said. And the way that the government or the person who's in charge determine the social landscape of monuments is not their reality. It's one option, and we interact with that. We can observe, we can understand that this is a monument that is that has a role, that has a function, that is supposed to do something in us, but we can interact with that. And as long as we have independent parts in our society that can have critical thinking, have an alternative way of thinking, and they can pinpoint other ways of thinking about it, I would say it's really an equivalent process at the individual level and at the societal level, and our way to remain independent of the large forces that shape our reality.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, this kind of sense of like the malleability of memory, I think that people have become very rigid actually in their thinking, and they hold very fast to their beliefs as if they can't change, or if the world isn't changing. And I think, again, to go back, I think the work that Monument Lab is actually doing is important because it's a creative project. And I think to be creative, science is incredible. People don't realize science is incredibly creative. You have to think about what we don't know. Art produces what we don't know. It is precisely its value because it does open up possibilities, right, of what the world could be. But it is terrifying. The unknown is absolutely terrifying. And that most people don't have that we don't cultivate, put it that way, that sense of creativity in such a way that people are open. And that's something I've learned as being somebody engaged in various forms of creative practice, whether it's working on design project, an art project, a curatorial project, an architectural project, that it's kind of wrestling with that I find then something emerges. And I don't know if it's, consensus. I much prefer to think about the possibilities that we are changing. It isn't that I come from here, you come from here, but that we transform in our engagement. And I wish, public education invested more in creativity, creative practices, and creative thinking, and cultivating that, because that's what I think is really missing.
Yeah, it's a really beautiful way to put it. Memory is a creative process, and it's also terrifying. So I remember when reconsolidation kind of came into light, and there was a lot of public interest in the phenomenon. A lot of people told me that it's actually horrible, because if you think about, oh my God, it's like, so my memories are actually not accurate. They're not exactly what happened, and it's suddenly it's like, who am I? And I confronted with that. I had to think about it very deeply because I didn't feel it was horrible. Eventually, what I realized is that it's actually really liberating.
It is
really liberating, and it's not like you lose all grounds. That there is a ground truth to it, but it's not where you think it is. At least that's my personal view. It's not in the way memory is being triggered. It's in how you react, how you behave now, what do you see? This is your memory, because this is the experience that shaped you. Mm-hmm. So it's like looking for memory elsewhere, not exactly where we think it is. And this is kind of the more liberating and creative process. And yeah, I really hope that at the monument and architecture level and at the personal level, these are equally important in developing awareness and knowledge and a different way to approach our memories.
Mm-hmm.
I'm particularly interested in this line of thinking. And so I'm going to ask Kijo Lee's question as a way of continuing to expand on how we create those spaces to be creative. Do you think that part of the friction or resistance can be found in the seemingly perpetual desire for linearity? Could we dismantle the general acceptance of retrieval as linear, past, present, future, and promote a nonlinear, rhizomatic version of memory? And I love the idea of starting with more creativity in schools, Mabel.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is kind of what we're talking about, like to remember, like to put things together. They don't come together exactly the same way. They're just, they get attached with other things and other associations. And so it's not like that's what I loved about, I keep going back to Memento, like it's never circular. It's like cycloidal. You're returning exactly what Daniela, it's somewhere else when you remember, because it's never the same memory. You can't do it. It doesn't work that way. But neither is it like exactly linear either. And I think the construction of a notion of linearity, right, which is to me tied to ideas of like progress, which then is associated with like all of this kind of baggage from the 19th century and ideas of modernity, kind of create something that is actually quite rigid and, like it has to go along this line. And I think, the relationships between these things are just far more complicated than the frameworks that we use to describe what they are.
Yeah, I would call it moments of linearity within a nonlinear framework, because you do need linearity at at a particular moment, which is where did you come from, what are you doing now, and what are you going to go next. In this sense, the moment is linear in how you perceive it, but the next moment is not a continuation, not necessarily a linear continuation of that. You can be in a different moment, thinking, kind of creating these loops separately. The way I like to think about it is like you take a book from the shelf, and by the act of reading it, when you put it back, it's just like not the same book anymore. So it's pretty hard to imagine with real books. But if you think about it, it's just like as a way of thinking, it should be more like that. And then it depends on which books you're taking out, which books you're reading one after the other, how you make connections between the books. In this sense, I'm all for the nonlinear perspective, but for linear moments. I hope it makes sense.
I am scrolling back through to find the question I wanted next. Thais Gould Jacinto. Hi, Tyrese. Do you feel that assimilation, migration, and modern colonization has caused difficulties in identifying issues of today with indifference? What's your opinion, and how do we address this? And I think that it's related to an anonymous question that we have, wondering how the contemporary media or social media can affect this task or possibly hijack our independent thought.
Wow. These are like monster questions, monster issues. But it was funny because I was going to go back and say, that there is what we experience, but then there is a way in which we socially name it, right? Like through language. But I do think more and more as we lived collectively, particularly our legacy in the West, like the emergence of capitalism and forms of abstraction, like that things can be abstracted and quantified. And so more and more and more and more like abstracted into numbers and quantify. And therefore this belief that we can, through those abstractions, make predictions, right? Say, calculate, whatever, that this is what it's going to be, somehow trying to control what that future might be. It does, kind of produce a certain kind of belief in power, right, of agency. A lot of it's patriarchal, for one thing. It's about dominance, it's about being godlike. And I think that it does, it's key to colonization. It was key to dominating people that you encountered enough to take their land, to take their labor, and to even take their life for the quest of your own personal gain in those encounters. And so, I think that, I think these kinds of constructs of things like, that depend on these structures of temporality, right? Long arcs of temporality, like history, that says you are modern versus being primitive. do a certain kind of work in the world, and they're still operative, very much so. Like in the history book that I learned architectural history through, my first history class, if you go back and look at it, you know, you end up with these lower branches of like Hindu, Persian, you know, like anything Asian, Southeast Asian, and then Egyptian, because the African continent doesn't exist. Incan, you know, they're the lower branches and they don't sprout up. But what's the tree that's sprouting is Europe, where you're getting Gothic and Baroque, and at the top of the tree is American, right? And so these hierarchies literally do structure the language that you enter into when I go to school to study architecture in ways that we're not aware of it. And so, you know, these frameworks are very problematic, and they are constructed on this sense of both knowledge, but also our experience of the world, right? Or at least the ideological, or these ways, you know, that knowledge is shaped.
Yeah, I can follow up on that. That I think in order to overcome these firm constructs that are kind of embedded and induced into our being, could be overcome with empathy. So it's a big word, but it's one of these words that you also think is automatic, that it's just like you're either empathic or not, that it's kind of sort of naturally arises, and if it doesn't, it's like, what can you do? But I think that sense of empathy is also it's an active process. You need to bring yourself in there. So, for example, if I think, you know, I feel I have like an intimate relationship with the Holocaust, I know it sounds weird, but I have been thinking about it like very, very hard and deeply. And I think that if I extend myself, at least my personal feeling is that I could imagine and understand in a way individual experiences of slavery. It's kind of an extension, and kind of feel the pain. It's a very intimate process. And also historically, you know, if we think about European history, if you just extend yourself and look at the African history and other cultures' history, as Mabel said, you will find that you have a lot of tools to identify and to understand, but you need to actively extend yourself. And so I think we need to remember that we can have a role, if not as a kind of a society at large, also as individuals, remembering to actively extend ourselves to others in order to understand.
Yeah, and I think that's really important, because I think it's things like, you know, it's exactly the kind of project of like race that's producing, like as humans, we're the same. Like there's just no difference amongst our species. But things like the creation of racial difference produces hierarchies, perceived hierarchies, right? That are kind of deadly. I mean, that do have consequences, but it's a complete construction that then is operative, right? And it had a role in capitalism, in colonialism. And it's not like these things don't bounce back, because in many ways, like the logic of fascism, right? That in Italy and in Germany was a colonial logic turned onto Europe. I mean, the domination, we're going to round people up, we're going to take their land, we're going to, you know, the project of that was as somebody, Amy Césaire writes, it was a colonial project. Europe just turned it on itself. And I think outside of those like frameworks, we have to start to think, well, who are we? Like, just as a species, like why can't we have this sense of kinship just as a species, you know, and that empathy beyond what these social categories are telling us to understand someone. And that's what I mean about being open to people who are not you, so that there are possibilities for things like empathy, for discovering things that you didn't know, people you don't know, things about the world you don't know. And that seems really, really, really vital, I think, if we're going to survive as a species on this planet, let's say.
We're going to go with species survival as a goal. We'll see how it goes. I think there are several questions that build on aspects of this conversation. questions of trauma as a contest, of the role of the assimilation of 19th century white ethnic immigrants into a collective white identity, of restacking hierarchies, and of the sort of idea of a colonial logic turned back on Europe that also begins with a colonial logic that starts in Europe, that starts with England turning to Scotland and Ireland and conquering them and moving forth. Those are clearly all structures of the eradication of empathy. How can collective memory, how can we teach empathy? How can we teach the reconstruction of our collective understandings to deconstruct structures that are so stubborn and so integral to the social fabric, so integral to capitalism globally, so integral to colonialism? How do we expand ourselves and help others to expand themselves?
I feel like we need to have cocktail hour to tackle it.
I know. I was paraphrasing that one, but also thinking like, let's figure out how we're going to save the species this morning. It's Friday morning. We got this.
Yeah. I wish we knew, how to teach empathy. What research suggests to some extent is that you could create situations where it's easier, like to prime someone, to direct perspective, to think in a certain way, to create a certain experience before you get information. So there are these factors that could influence how empathic you are and when. I still think it has a lot to do with you willing to do that and making an effort to do that. About the question of whether it's a contest, absolutely not. I would hope so. And it goes to what I said earlier. It's like, don't pool all traumas together, or it's like you don't, because you would diminish, you can't cluster all experiences in order to diminish all of them together or make one trauma more important than the other. There is room and should be room for all of them and acknowledging all of them. So it shouldn't be a contest like my trauma is bigger than yours, or because of my trauma, I'm not going to be able to understand your trauma. There has to be room for all of these. I remember I had a friend who underwent a traumatic event, and he said that the most annoying thing that people can do to him is that when he says something, like, yeah, I suffer from this, I have that, and the first thing people will say is like, yeah, I had the same experience, and it would completely annoy him. It's like, no, I didn't ask about your experience. I just want you to understand my experience. And I know it comes from a good place, that many people just want to show they identify. But this is all to say that it's a very delicate process of understanding when to bring your own trauma, how to put it, how to allow both experiences to stay in the same space while still have a conversation and understanding, and create a situation of empathic experience because of these two traumas. It's a delicate process. I think it requires a lot of effort and education and intention.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of agree with Daniela that it's work. Like it's not something that's going to happen automatically. I think it's also becoming more difficult. I don't think these social media platforms are helpful. I wish Mark Zuckerberg had finished Harvard, maybe taken some philosophy classes, maybe psychology. Like, not everybody wants to be your friend. And so, like, he has this complete misreading. It's just, humans are complicated. And when you make platforms for humans to connect, these networks can easily be appropriated for more nefarious. And the same thing, with Twitter, with Jack, like they've taken things like friendship and conversation and monetized it. And that's very problematic, and not want to police it or not want to control it, so that it undermines maybe good institutions that do structure us. to such an extent that it becomes toxic to our social relations. I think the real work has to be done maybe on an individual basis between people. I think it's empathy. I think it's listening. I think it's caring. I think it has to be a process, and we have to be open. We have to be poets, actually. I think that's, and I mean poet in the sense that poesis is about making. We have to make these relationships. We can't push a button and have them appear. It's work. That is something that people have to be willing to invest in. It's not going to be magic at all. And, you know, something's going to have to give, because we're just not going to make it as a species on the planet. Because we have hurricanes and fires and things barreling down on us because we don't change our behavior about how we engage the world. And we have to change how we live, and that's vital. And that's going to be work, and it's got to be on a like micro level, starting with, you know, our own homes, outward to our communities, and then outward, you know, to however you see yourselves nationally or planetarily. So.
I wanted to hold that thought for a second. I kind of still want to hold that thought, thinking about expanding planetarily. We have a question about addressing how you think healing influences memories as opposed to reconciliation. So in essence, the distinction between healing and reconciliation. I'd like to think about that in terms of that global, that we look at the world right now, where we are in this moment, and we have an unprecedented challenge as a species to survive together, or to break into constituent parts that essentially guarantee that we will not. Do we heal? Do we reconcile? Do we compromise? How do we build what we need to survive this moment, to build a better world? It's really not a Friday morning question. Sorry, y'all.
Well, I have been thinking just a lot and looking a lot at radical care practices, thinking about post-pandemic, which is what we're in, the massive protests that were going on, like, and I never, until I look, I'm a big fan of the Oxford English Dictionary. Just look it up on the OED, I always say. But if you look up the term care, it speaks about it says something like mournful and traumatic. And so it is what you do in the aftermath, essentially, of something that has happened, right? So care, it's like what you do after the revolution's over, right? You've got to care. It's the work that has to be done in the aftermath of something. And I feel care work is so marginalized, but so necessary. And that goes to maintaining our environment, restoring our environment, like all of those terms, repair, reparations, like all of that stuff is under that umbrella of care. But it is also, in our capitalist economy, it is devalued. It is exactly the labor that isn't paid for. These are maintenance workers. These are the health caretakers. These are, the people that are caring for the sick, caring for the children. Like, it's just not valued. And it's often feminized labor. People have written about this. It's racial, it's people of color who do that work. But it's the most important work. It is the front line, in fact, of people. And they're the most vulnerable. And yet this is the work that really needs to be done. I mean, like that I think is vital, and it has to be valued. like, who cares for the youth? Those are educators, right? And that's just marginalized. The only thing people, I think, care about right now is making money, and that's useless, right? In the end, money, it's the people who do the things that you purchase with money, right? But money in the abstract it's there because we believe it has value. And I think our values should shift to doing more care work.
Yeah, I can also only briefly add that I think that reconciliation and healing are interactive processes. So healing can help reconciliation, or reconciliation can help healing. Ideally, you will do both, kind of each process feeding each other.
We have just about 5 minutes left in our panel. So I am not going to throw another hard question at the two of you. But I am going to ask, what is your work next? What is the thing that you are excited about in this moment, looking towards the future? You can do rock, paper, scissors.
Well, I feel like in terms of science, I'm pretty grateful to be in an era that we experience a paradigm shift in how we view memories. And I feel it's getting more and more substantiated in science, such that it will more and more propagate into everyday understanding and into kind of public embracing of these findings. It's a long process of many years, but I'm hopeful in many domains. I really wish to, at the personal level, to find something that will help with trauma. And I hope science will get us there. It's like we're not there yet, but I hope so. And another thing that we're starting to investigate and understand better is actually social relationships, and it kind of links to the higher level. There's interesting processes in how the brain is tracking relationships. It seems to be similar really to an act of navigation in a space. And even the brain processes that are required to navigate physical space appear to be actually similar and applied to how we navigate social relationships. And science is going into the direction of looking at the dynamics of social relationships. And one understanding is that in order to navigate, that is to move from one point to another, you have to interact. So just like, you can view a map and stay at home and you wouldn't move anywhere. But if you actually go out and move, that's how you navigated space. It's similar in relationship. So in this sense, the message is that online relationships are not real relationships. They're mostly relationships with yourself. It's like you process most information, you interpret the information, and kind of you imagine what the interaction is. But it's not an actual interaction. It has very little of the information and the experience that shapes interactions. So I hope we will overcome that. That's another realization we need to do in addition to all the other ones that I've been talking about, about empathy and what is memory. It's also what is relationships, and it's an illusion when we make the interpretation mostly in our heads, as if we interacted with someone else, but it's really mostly in our heads. If we come to this realization, I think it will greatly control, the impact of social media. And I very much hope we'll get there as a healing process from our new technology that is controlling our lives at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's so much going on in the world. I mean, I just feel like I just want to get through the next 6 months. Like on the other side into February would be, you know, like, what does that look like? We'll still be in a pandemic, but maybe we'll be out of this election cycle. But I do think, you know, the real conversations of reckoning with whiteness and the legacies of white supremacy in this country are really vital and have to continue and have to be taken into our respective institutions and where we work, so the work can be done to really dismantle that. Otherwise, you know, it's just going to continue to replicate itself, shape shift, and be deadly for many people. And I mean, I'm optimistic that that can happen, but I think, again, it's going to just require work, openness, creativity, empathy, like all of these things, because we have to have some changes. Otherwise, you know, our social structure, particularly framed by our nation state, right, that is organizing us, it can collapse, which is what people never recognized. And I think that, you know, that's something that is, yeah, it's something that will be on the horizon.
On the joyous note of healing trauma, fixing social media, and dismantling white supremacy, I want to thank you both so much for this incredible conversation. You are both wonderful to think with and speak with and hear from. I am going to hand the mic back to the rest of the Monument Lab team and pass to Patricia Kim, who will be introducing the fellows videos. Patricia Kim is an art historian, curator, and educator based in New York City. She's assistant professor and faculty fellow at New York University's Gallatin School of Individualized Study and assistant curator and communications director at Monument Lab. She also stops me from making mistakes on our social media. And I love her.
Oh, thank you, Sue. Thanks so much to Mabel, Danielle, and Sue for that super inspiring conversation around care and healing. I really learned so much. And hello to everyone watching from home or wherever you might be. Thanks for joining us on day 2 of Monument Lab's Town Hall. As Sue mentioned, my name is Patricia Kim. And yesterday you met some of our amazing 2020 Transnational Artist Fellows, and I'm so excited and humbled to introduce our other fellows whom you haven't yet met. And so all our Artist Fellows create new ways of making and envisioning public art that is engaged and above all confronts systems of knowledge that are rooted in racist, sexist, and colonial regimes. What I admire most about each and every one of our fellows is that the process and outcomes of their work are really informed by an ethics of care, which was, I think, a major and important theme that continued to come up in our last panel conversation. So today you'll learn more about our artists, including Sergio Beltran Garcia, Ulfaminde, Tomia Rai, Patrick Weems, and Madad, a collective including Damon Davis, Mallory Ruxana, Nizam, and Dee Nichols.
My name is Sergio Beltran Garcia. I am trained as an architect, and the name of my project is the Dispersed Memorial. The Dispersed Memorial it's actually answering a question that I've asked myself for a long time. I've been working on memorial projects for 7 years now. And one of the main issues I've found is that victims of human rights violations have a really hard time getting access to the right to memory and to the right to construct memorials to commemorate the violence that they suffered in such a way that we can remember and not forget. So the Dispersed Memorial, what it does, it is basically a DIY kit, a very low-cost modular design piece. And the idea is to give easy access to different people to connect their stories through this object. What I'm doing in phase 1 for Monument Lab is building 10 prototypes. which will be deployed in different parts of Mexico to bring together stories around loss surrounding the pandemic. I went back to Berlin to do an exchange year, and I started to obsessively hunt memorials. And at that same time, the war on drugs was raging back home in Mexico. And I started thinking about the time when we would start building memorials to the victims of this war. And to start asking myself, can a memorial stop conflict? I've also started understanding a lot more what it means to work with anti-racist artists and decolonization. Coming from a country that was colonized, you kind of understand in your gut, but like working with people, you know, like Quentin or like Damon or like Alicia, like I start understanding that their fight is also my fight. And what we're trying to work together is this culture of memory that is critical and that is emancipatory. It is not really about yesterday, it is about who we are today and who we want to be tomorrow. That's what memory is for. And that's something that Monument Lab has really helped me like ground, you know, what it means to be part of a wider international community of memory practitioners.
My name is Ulfaminde. I'm based in Berlin, and I'm an artist, I'm an activist, and I'm an educator. My project is the anti-racist memorial on Kolbstrasse that will commemorate the two neo-Nazi bombings in Cologne, Germany. One in 2001 in Propsteigasse and the nail bombing in Kolbstrasse, both perpetrated by Nazi terror network NSU. The idea is to create a forum for anti-racist knowledge, and the memorial will be a cinematic stage and a curated archive for any form of resistance against racism. It consists of a concrete floor slab. It's 6 to 24 meter long, which is an exact copy of the concrete floor slab of the house in Kolbstrasse, Kolb Street, where the nail bomb exploded. And this slab, it becomes the foundation of the memorial. It will be like a dance floor, it's gonna be a skater place to meet, or even a minimalist sculpture, and it should be definitely used. So, and with the help of augmented reality technology comes the decisive, crucial part of the memorial, because based on the geodata of the concrete slab with a Wi-Fi network and the corresponding app, any smartphone or also tablet can transform the concrete slab into a house that grows endlessly into the sky. And while the walls themselves consist of films that can be activated and watched by users on their devices. And this multitude of films creates a virtual house on the smartphone that can be entered by everyone. Monuments in the future, they will be mobile, they will be triggered by multiplicity, they will be decentralized, they will make social movements tangible and experienceable, or even initiate them. But above all, they will not restrict social movement. They will provide a stage for articulating social protest. They will provide a stage for questioning major societies, and definitely they will be anti-racist, they will be queer feminist, and they have a deep class consciousness, and everything else will fall.
My name is Tumia Arai, and I'm speaking to you from New York City, where I was born and raised. The name of my project is Asian Pacific American Voices, a COVID-19 public memory project. Well, I think that I was always interested in themes of art and history and memory. My love, for instance, for Chinatown and for New York City, and my desire as an artist to document those places that I love in the city and that I want to protect. Using my work and the projects that I've done in collaboration with communities was one way to reclaim and recontrol those narratives, and rewrite them. The APA Voices COVID-19 Public Memory Project is an archive project where we are collecting interviews and artifacts from people in the Asian Pacific American community who were in many ways disproportionately impacted by the virus, as many communities of color have been. Parts of this project is to do story circles and podcasts and invite people to participate in this collection. Our memories are social, and they reside in all the things around us. And so when we begin to lose those things, we lose a part of ourselves.
My name is Patrick Weems. I'm in Sumner, Mississippi. My project is the Emmett Sill Memorial, and specifically to develop a memorial site at the river where Emmett Sill's body came out of the Tallahatchie River. A 14-year-old child who came down to Mississippi in August of 1955. During his visit, he had an interaction with Carolyn Bryant. That interaction led to his kidnapping, torture, and murder. I got involved in this project in 2007, working with the community of Tallahatchie County, led by a man named Jerome G. Little, who was the first Black Board Supervisor in Tallahatchie County. And Jerome had a mission to honor Emmett Till, because for 50 years, nobody talked about Till. It was completely erased from the physical landscape, but also the cultural landscape. Just saving the sites is the first step. There are a lot of the Till sites, the church in Chicago, the actual murder site, none of those have been preserved, and it's a huge tragedy that we've forgotten this history. We recently were able to convince a local farmer to give us the land by the Tallahatchie River, which was not an easy feat. Many white people in the Delta are still resistant to this story being told. So to be able to work with the local community, both Black and white, to honor Till has been a real struggle, but we know where the most harm has happened, the most healing can take place.
My name is Damon Davis. I'm a post-disciplinary artist, and I am based in St. Louis, Missouri.
My name is Dee Nichols, and I am a design strategist, and currently I am based in Memphis, Tennessee.
I'm Mallory Ruxana Nizam. I am currently sheltering in St. Louis, but I'm based out of Oakland, California.
We represent the intersection of art, activism, and organizing, and social justice, but also joy, and thinking about the ways in which those interweave and have impact on the ways that we understand our city, navigate it, and advocate for human rights within it. The short name of our project is Black Memory STL. We are focused on division, displacement that exists in the city, as well as local diaspora. The sense of people moving and being forced to move across the city in conditions that continue to divide us, and being able to unearth different histories that have been ignored and lost and disregarded because of that, but also creating new histories, recognizing and honoring spaces where Black St. Louis history has happened.
I think it's also about amending memory and telling a full story about a culture and a place. and putting in just missing parts of the puzzle that we all know exist, but saying it out loud, and so to give validation and vindication to the people that actually lived through it that didn't have a voice before, because most of the time it's the same person telling the story. A lot of our stuff is also amending those false narratives and those half-truths that we get a lot in American history.
I hope also that future monuments are can be collectively created. One thing that binds us all together is is service. Our work is not about just us. It is about the communities that we're part of. And I think we all have a deep love for St. Louis. And when you love something, you help it become better. And that can be a painful process, and it can mean digging up skeletons and having confrontations, but it's part of love. This project is important, and memory projects and memorial projects in general. Honoring history is important so that we don't perpetuate harm in the future. So we actually can remember to then create a better future collectively.
I want to first thank Susana Solomon, who produced all of our amazing fellows videos, and be sure to keep up with all of our fellows on social media. You can find all their handles and learn more about their work if you follow us at monument_lab on Instagram, Twitter, find us on Facebook, or even on LinkedIn, so you can follow us there as well. I'm thrilled to introduce our next panel, Confronting Art and History, moderated by Monument Lab's brilliant co-founder and curatorial advisor, Ken Lum. Ken is a Canadian artist and the Marilyn Jordan Taylor Presidential Professor and Chair of the Fine Arts Department at the University of Pennsylvania, Stuart Weitzman School of Design. Ken, over to you.
Okay, thanks very much, Kim. I'm honored to be the panelist for two distinguished guests. I know that their biographies are in the brochure, but I just want to reiterate a couple of points about them. Miriam Sadoff is the director of the Munich Documentation Center for the History of National Socialism. Dr. Sadoff was previously professor of history at Indiana University Bloomington. She is the author of Next Year in Marienbad, The Lost Worlds of Jewish Spa Culture, as well as the book Werner Schlolem, A German Life. So welcome, Miriam. I'm also pleased to introduce Seth Rodney, who is the senior editor at Hyperallergic, arguably the most influential online art and cultural website today. Dr. Rodney is the winner of the 2020 Rabkin Prize for Arts Journalism. He is the author of the book, The Personalization of the Museum Visit, Art Museums, Discourse, and Visitors. So welcome both to Seth and to Miriam. I guess I'd like to open up to the questioning. Firstly, just to ask how you both have been able to maintain yourself during this time of turmoil, of COVID, of racial reckoning, of social justice reckoning, and so on. So how have you been able to maintain yourself during this period? Maybe we'll start with Seth.
I was actually about to defer to Miriam. Miriam, okay. Please.
Okay. Thank you. First of all, thank you so much for inviting me to be in this panel. I did not manage to listen to everything so far during these 2 days, but I listened in and I was most fascinated, and I'm really grateful that you're putting this forum together, this transatlantic exchange, which I think we really need, especially now in this, well, due to the pandemic, because we're also isolated, and we've discovered new means of discussion across the ocean. We don't have to fly, we still can be together. But then again, also so much has changed and is constantly changing in this year with the pandemic, with the George Floyd protests, and with the American election coming up, which has tremendous influence on Europe as well and on the discourse on democracy. And this is something that we're observing from here very closely. Germans are obsessed with news on President Trump and on what is going on in the United States. And at the same time, the situation in America has sparked a lot of change here. And this is something that has been really important for me this year. And I've been thinking a lot about it and sort of being constantly between reading the news here and there. And it of course also influences our work. And I just want to briefly talk about the exhibition that we've started by the end of last year, in which you participate, Ken, which was for us a way of, embarking on a completely new path, because we are a museum that deals with the history of National Socialism. And we brought into this museum almost 50 artists who deal with memory, but also not only in the German context, but in a transnational context, and also with the colonial issues, with African American issues, with structural racism in the United States. And what we've seen throughout the year is that many of the discussions that we wanted to start are actually now, you cannot take them off the general discourse anymore. And this is something that is really fascinating. It happens here in Germany, but it happens transnationally. And I think this is something really important about memory. Memory is often perceived and discussed in national contexts and with national limitations, but we have to start discussing on a transnational and global level.
So I just want to ask you to reiterate the question for me, Ken.
In the context of all the social reckoning that's taking place this year, obviously COVID-19, racial justice issues, climate change, everything's kind of converging during this in a very concentrated form during the last year or so. Obviously, these issues have been percolating for some time, and so I'm wondering how you are maintaining yourself. What are you actually
doing?
Yeah, you're doing, and how are you constituting yourself at this moment?
Great question. So my answer is going to be very practical. I am keeping in touch a lot more with friends and my chosen family. So people in the art scene who I'm really close to, I'm just on the phone a lot more. Zoom calls are difficult because I do Zoom a lot, as we are doing now. And it is a way to connect to my kind of professional family. But I am on the phone a lot with people who are friends and closer to me. I find that the voice really gives me a sense of intimacy in a way, and oddly enough, that video doesn't do, not in the same way. Other things that I've been doing to maintain myself is actually just getting out of the house and running. I mean, my situation has changed kind of drastically in the last few months because I moved from the South Bronx to Newburgh, which is up the Hudson River Valley, right across the water from Beacon. And so during the first few months of COVID-19, what I was doing when I was living in the South Bronx was just taking long walks. I would be at my computer screen most of the day doing the work that I do for Hyperallergic. I'm actually their opinions editor now. And we recently started a Sunday edition, which is themed. So Harag Vartanian and I have been working on that. And that's taken up a lot of my intellectual capital. So the ways I go about rejuvenating myself is I go on long walks, and then I found a park nearby my house when I was in the South Bronx where I could run. It had a 1/4-mile track and I could run on that. And there's something about the physical activity of just being embodied without doing this sort of like higher mind-brain functioning stuff of dealing with abstract ideas, which is what I do most of the day. There's something about letting that go and just being in your body in a really intentional, purposeful way, and it feels like opening a window and letting sunlight and air. So that's been a big part of me feeling somewhat, I guess I want to use the word normal, like feeling like I can make it through this, what Sylvia Plath would call this season of fatigue.
And how has, maybe we can start with you as well, Saf, on this round. How has that opening of the window, how's that altered the way you think about the way art operates, how art conducts itself, and how it is articulated through galleries and museums?
Yeah, so great question. One of the things I can answer this question in terms of two things that I've recently experienced, very recently experienced. One was writing a piece about how the blue chip galleries in New York City have seemingly responded to these overlapping crises with their fall programs. And I wrote this, published this in Hyperlogic, I want to say maybe 10 days ago. And basically I took most of these galleries to task. It was David Zwirner, Pace, Hauser and Wirth, and Gagosian. And I talked about their fall programs, and some of them had made adjustments. I understand, and I admitted this in the piece, that galleries tend to plan these programs a year in advance at least, right? So it's seemingly slightly unfair or critique to say, well, what are you doing now? But I am of the opinion that given the heightened nature of these crises, that galleries could make decisions to move shows further along the pipeline and move some up, and they have in some instances. But what came out of that conversation, well, that piece and the subsequent conversation I had with people on social media, Twitter and Facebook, Nina Kachadurian reached out to me because she has a show that is at Pace, and she objected to, in some ways, me suggesting, her perspective, me suggesting that her show was just a token, because most of these, my conclusion with the piece I wrote was that these for-profit spaces aren't really about making money, making meaning, they're about making money and then about making markets. Meaning is further down the list. But Nina and I had a public conversation, and then we had a private one. We spoke on the phone about what her work seeks to do and be in this context. And she's looking at, it's a long ongoing project, looking at sloganeering and political rhetoric. And what that changed for me is it made me realize, or made me think again about how even within a very mercenary, profit motive centered context, we still find ways to make work that is politically and socially meaningful. And I think Nina is doing that. So I want to shout her out for that. And the other thing that's happened to me is I recently was asked to be the visiting art critic for the Yale MFA students this semester. And what I found in my conversations with these students is again, something that slightly sort of escapes that market money-making social status drain, and which is these students are actually operating from a place of genuine curiosity. And that I find really refreshing, because I think that given my job as an art critic, I'm used to walking into galleries and museums all the time and being given a spiel about what the work is supposed to be and do. But with talking with students, what I get from them is they often don't know. They're often just experimenting, and that's great. That's fine. That's what they should be doing. Like, they should have a sense of like adventure, a sense of, well, let's try this and see what happens. And I love that, because that is as close as we get as human beings, in, it seems, in this art scene context, to acting for free. Just, I want to do that. I want to be and find and cultivate ways for us to act for free.
And Miriam, I feel like I need to reframe the question, because I don't think it actually quite applies to your position as a chief, as a director of the National Socialist Documentation Center and so on. But I guess in a parallel vein, that has have certain things changed for you in terms of the conduct, the role that not just historical museums, but maybe historical museums play in relationship to contemporary art?
Let me start with the running, because I think that's something that is really interesting about this situation, because I started running too for the first time in my life. And what you've described, Seth, was really important, this sense of, I don't know, sort of like, maintaining some sort of physical strength and also independence to what is going on. So sort of being constantly stuck to the news. First it was the pandemic, now it's again the pandemic, and then it's the election, and then it's this and that, and you're constantly surrounded by screens, and then you tell your children, don't use screens all the time, and you're really a bad example. And so the running really saved me in many ways. I would not, if somebody would have told me that, I would have just laughed at them. And I think this was the case for a lot of people. And it really helped opening this window, letting the sun in, letting thoughts flow in a way that was more difficult, because we are confined to our very intimate spaces where we're not, all the traveling, all the meeting people, exchanging, nothing is normal anymore. And I think this is difficult for both the academic world, the art world, but also democracy in general. We're not supposed to meet anymore, but democracy is based on people assembling, meeting each other, seeing each other, hearing each other. It is terrible. I don't know if you have ever experienced an argument on Zoom, like a real argument, a political argument, an ideological argument. It's very unpleasant, because you don't feel the temperature in the room, and cannot, anything you say is not accompanied by a gesture that might transform your argument in something else. But so this is the situation we're dealing with. And here in Germany, we have been, so far, we have had a much better situation than in the US. We had a very calm summer. I'm right now, I'm here in a hotel room in Berlin, and Berlin is one of the new hotspots of Germany. So we'll see if this is changing now. But one of the big differences, of course, is that many museums, not most of them, many museums are state funded here, and entirely state funded often. And in our case, in March, we got the permission to have no admissions anymore. And that was already during the pandemic. And I was very glad that we managed to do that, because it completely changes how people visit our space and see our space. But the question is, of course, and I think this is one of the big issues that we're all grappling with, is what kind of museums or spaces of art and academic exchange, historic exchange, are we envisioning for the future? Are we returning to this world of yesterday, of before the pandemic? This is one crisis. We have more crises ahead, and so the next one, climate change, refugees, it will just get worse. And for that, we need strong democracies that obviously in many countries we don't have right now, because they're being dismantled. And so the question for me is, in what ways can museums be turned into democracy labs, into spaces that are really, as you suggest, Ken, with this program, reshaping the past, because different experts, different people are being invited in telling a different past. Because one of the experiences we have made, and it's maybe banal, but you cannot persuade someone else of a story that you're telling. You have to make them part of the storytelling process. And I think this this inclusive process, this multidirectional memory, as Michael Rothberg called it, I think is something that we definitely need to tell different kinds of stories, and furthermore also to link memory to solidarity, to link memory to historical responsibility, and you know, to also give it some character of insurgence. Germany had a long sort of history of dealing with the memory of the Holocaust, of the Nazi past, and in the last 20-25 years, many institutions here were created that are enabling this process, and they have inspired other contexts, in other countries, like for example, the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Alabama was partly inspired by the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin. And so this exchange is incredibly important. But on the other hand, what we see now in Germany, and that was a result of the George Floyd protests, is that that we were sort of oblivious of the German colonial past. It hasn't been discussed. It has basically been forgotten, and there's this you know, worry that that, you know, now we're exchanging one memory for another, which is of course not the case. I think memory needs this kind of context, and I don't think that there's I think that empathy creates more empathy. It's not that, you know, if you create empathy for one group, if you institutionalize memory in one direction, it's impossible to work in another direction. No, I'm sure that empathy does create more empathy. And this is something that is very controversially discussed in Germany right now. And I see our role in sort of creating this radical change out of the pandemic in this direction.
Yeah, and if I could just continue on with you, Miriam, then follow up with Seth. You know, you mentioned democracy, and democracy invokes, as you say, multi-directional voices, multi-valence, multiple recognitions of histories. And so how does that convergence take place such that it doesn't become relativized? Like, right? If there are so many claims to history, then how does collective memory take place?
Well, I think that, you know, it's always, the problem is, of course, if you want to introduce a democratic process into the sort of creating memory process, this is what we need to do, because many countries and most of the countries, actually, they follow some national myth that is being created by a majority for whatever reason. The point is, of course, that we have to tell these kind of different memories, because otherwise we're leaving people out. So the past is being created by one group, and the past of the other groups just doesn't exist. And I don't think that we should look at it as, you know, in some way that it's a competition of different kinds of memories. It's not exclusive. I think that people can deal with the ambivalences. I think that people can deal with complex, you know, a complex past, and not just sort of like one story. People are, I think we sometimes underestimate what people can do. And the experience we've made with this exhibition in our center is that we suddenly had a completely different audience, an audience that was much more diverse, and kind of like saw itself represented in this story. Because one of the big issues in Germany is, of course, when people are moving to this country, should they adopt the German history as their own? Should they adopt the history of National Socialism as their own, or do they bring their own histories of being refugees, of leaving a place, of their own scars, whatever they have experienced with them? And I think it's in many ways it's both. They're coming to a country, they're getting to know it, and they see that this country is being shaped by a very specific past. Then of course it's important to include them in the discourse, but it's also important to include their past, their experience, because if we leave that out, how should they be seen as someone writing this history, being part of this story? And history is so important for a nation. And you just look at President Trump, he wants history books rewritten. Poland rewrites its history books. Hungary rewrites its history books. It's, populism or this neo-fascism, they know exactly that these culture wars are very much defined by history, by culture, but also by the history of a nation and whatever comes with that.
Thank you, Mary. What about you, for you, Youssef? I'm also thinking in terms of your own biography, Jamaican and such, and what is collective memory for you today?
Great question. I am going to take a very different tact, which is to talk about how collective memories get formed through popular culture. Because one of the things that I notice going to cocktail parties and starting up conversations with people who are around the same age I am, right? We're in the same field, generally art, museums, culture, la, la, la. But we don't know each other. We talk about television. We talk about what moments we remember from childhood that bind us together. And I find that fascinating, that there's a way in which popular culture, the sort of, we were all kind of feeding at the same trough. So we remember Wonder Woman, right? We remember Scooby-Doo, or more recently, we remember the moment when TV in the US started to actually become really good. It started to be a place where people told long, serialized, ongoing stories where people they actually had character development, right? So we talk about like The Sopranos and Breaking Bad, and perhaps the best TV show that's ever been on TV, The Wire, which is really a kind of like sociological study of the overlapping and intersecting aspects of a city that make it possible to function as a city, right? So you're talking about labor unions, you're talking about the police force, you're talking about formal education, la, la, la. The court system, the political system, sort of all sort of interacting with each other. So collective memory is not just formed in the sort of large-scale institutions that we're all really familiar with, museums and galleries and the like. They're actually also formed, and this is, visual culture as a discipline gives us the sort of tongs by which to grasp this. That collective memory gets formed in popular culture, and those stories have everything to do with how we look at ourselves as the culture and what we want and what we value. So for example, one of the big conversations that's been happening, has come percolating up to the surface lately, is how much in the US, in terms of TVs and film, we've been saturated for the past generation with stories about how police do their business. So police procedurals are constant, right? And I saw this on Twitter the other day and I thought, that's right, like this is the water I've been swimming in for a long time. This idea that we are invested in how police catch the bad guys, right? That has everything to do with how we view police in general and how we submit to their authority unquestioningly too much, I would say. And that conversation, I should say, is starting to shift because we're starting to see in real life how police, officers of the state, sometimes arbitrarily take the lives of Black people and other people of color. So, the Breonna Taylor story is huge for that. The George Floyd story is huge because there's a moment now of where that collective memory that's been formed via the access pathways of television and film and news reporting are coming up to be at odds with what we're witnessing actually out in the street. So there's a profound moment, I think, of kind of cognitive dissonance. And I think one of the ways people work through that is they go outside and they march and they protest and they put their embodied lives on the line. So for me, cultural memory consists in these kind of it's the ancient story, right, of the hearth in the middle of blackest night, where it's cold outside and we need to gather around a fire, look in it, be warm, and tell each other stories. We've been doing this in different, more sophisticated ways through these media. And that's where cultural collective memory is also formed. And I'm glad that actually we're starting to kind of grok that in the art scene, and we're starting to document that and comment on it. One of the ways that we do that at Hyperallergic is we have a whole editor section that's an editor who's dedicated to looking at documentary, film, television, so on and so forth. And our visual culture sections are really robust. We're thinking about this because I think this is where we live.
Thank you, Seth. Maybe I'll start with you, and because just a segue from your point about collective memory as it pertains to contemporary art, because if I may, just this last question before I draw some from the audience. For years, artists of color, right, they constitute part of the forgotten memory or unacknowledged memory of the history of, the historical unfolding of art, right? But not just artists of color, but also curators of color. They have voiced complaint about their uneven treatment by museums or their being ignored. Usually these museums were almost always led by white directors, male mostly, and then and everyone's ignored, or they paid the price for complaining. Artists of color would tell their stories among themselves, right? And I know I'm an artist of color as well. So, but now it seems every institution has gained a consciousness about race and difference. Beating to the door to issue statements about redressing the culture in their respective institutions, institutions that they have themselves been running for many years. And so now they've made promises to diversify leadership and boards of directors and so on. This moment makes me think about James Baldwin and his, ruminations about, are we talking about a kind of reordering from within, or are we talking about this destruction, right? And so on. So just your thoughts on that important question.
So what's coming to mind right now is something that links with a really captivating phrase that Miriam used earlier, which was, it was a question really. She posed the question, can we make museums into democracy labs? And that makes me think of a moment in my book about the personalization of the museum visit, where I say, we use the term democracy in some instances cavalierly, and I think we mean different things. In the book, I say, one of the ways that we mean democracy is or making museums into more democratic institutions. What we mean by that, or what some people mean, is we want to deepen and broaden engagement. So we want more people to be able to come into the museum and see some aspect of themselves there, right? Some aspect of their own stories represented within the museum. That is a kind of democratization of the institution, for sure, it is. But there's another kind, which is even more profound, which is, can the museum shift the way it's structured? One of the structures is with curators on top, right? And everyone else sort of like below them, education below them, marketing below them. So it's like curators basically seeing the museum as a kind of a sort of playground in which they can construct sweeping historical narratives that will sort of like take visitors on a wild ride. I mean, that's that's a sort of crude way of talking about what how most museums are structured. But what if they change their internal structure so that you combine, as the Museum von Abba has done, you combine education and curation into a single position where you have a visitor experience manager, right? That's a different way of thinking about the institution's relationship to the visitor. And I would argue the profound way of thinking about becoming a democratic institution or a lab for democracy is fundamentally changing the way an institution relates to its community. How do you relate to your community? Where do you put the money, right? In your budget, is there a line for public programming? What does that line look like in comparison to exhibitions? What does that line look like in comparison to your acquisition funds? Like where are you allocating resources? It's in those questions and in that kind of agenda that you find a really profound concern for an allegiance to, commitment to becoming a democratic institution.
And Miriam?
Yeah, well, I absolutely agree. We're a little bit in a different situation because since we're not an art museum, the education is kind of like in the center of what we're doing, because it's constantly about this process of translating, the issues on history, historical facts, to a very diverse and broad audience, and it's a complicated process because our permanent exhibition, which I inherited it. It's very good. It's a historical documentation that functions only on the rational level. So you constantly have to think about this process of education, of getting, and not just education, of making people part of that, and not addressing just a very specific audience. That's why we brought in art. So we have some more individual kind of emotional approach, individual biographies of artists so that people connect to them. But we're trying to do more and more projects, with even schools that are doing their own exhibitions in our space, which is super complicated because then you give away your your role becomes the one who says, okay, I can live with that and I have to live with whatever you're doing here. You can guide them, but it's problematic. It's not easy. And I really appreciate what you're doing at Monuments Lab with these radical participation. And I think this is what we have to do. But it is complicated because we give away sort of most of our sort of power to define. We can just guide, we can just, be part of this discussion. But of course, our role becomes less important than the traditional role of curators or educators. But I see, and especially now with the pandemic, with the younger people, I see them less and less accepting these old hierarchies. That has changed already much before, but it's changing further. They're in a situation where they often have to make their own decisions. They're not in schools. They're on their own in their learning processes. And then you get them into a museum and they have to listen to a guide and to some lecture. They don't want to. They're not interested in that anymore. They're used to creating their or being part of this creative process. And I think we really have to do that. I think that is very important that we find ways of allowing participation or collaboration on a much deeper level than we used to do that before. And just one word to what you've mentioned on cultural memory, Steph. I thought that was very important. For example, in German memory culture, which is kind of like I think one example that sometimes can help to develop memory in a way, but also helps to see where Germany in some ways did good things, and some in other ways there is still a long way to go. We have a president that can openly say that he loves his country only with a broken heart, which I think was a wonderful quote, and I'm very happy to hear that. But still, there are many things that I wouldn't say that we can teach other people. I think we have to learn on many levels. But one of the things that started this process in Germany, really, to talk about the atrocities committed by fathers and uncles and family members, was an American TV series. It was the TV series Holocaust that really sparked a broad discussion in Germany on the atrocities and on a very conflicted past. And I think that that was really an important moment. And I'm thinking a lot about that because in the last couple of years, we've often also screened movies on James Baldwin and structural racism in the United States. And lots of people in Germany were really interested. But they would say afterwards, oh yeah, I've always liked Spike Lee, but he's really exaggerating. And this is really exaggerating. And only this year people understood what racism or structural racism in the US actually means. And I think I really think that this transatlantic exchange is very, very important. There is this part in Baldwin's writings when he writes about coming to France and experiencing a different kind of situation and enjoying it very much and starting a learning process through that. And also Du Bois, when he comes to Berlin, he talks a lot about the situation of the Jews in Berlin. So I think we really have to talk more because there are many misunderstandings or misconceptions, and we need these people who are going back and forth and really are going back and forth and explaining to each other what is going on in the other country and how we can actually really participate in this memory process that is happening across the Atlantic.
Miriam, I'm going to maybe zigzag with you again and then go to Steph, and I would kind of reframe the question slightly as it applies to the United States. But one of the people participating in this wrote a good question, Sergio Bertrand Garcia. And he asked, there are many examples, especially in pre-World War II regimes of the 20th century, where art and memory were mobilized to consolidate authoritarianism. Today, most memorials modeled after the German experience of atonement fail to signal the return of authoritarianism. How do we mobilize a critical memory that won't strengthen such authoritarian impulses, which exert control over politics and aesthetics? And I would just add that in the United States, we are seeing a return to authoritarianism unambiguously. And yet, is that a fair critique of the to suggest that there's a degree of incapacity or lack of imagination or will even to address these this tendency? So I'll start with Miriam, then Steph.
I hope I understood. There was a short my Wi-Fi made a short break here, as I didn't really get everything. But so it's about this question of the new authoritarianism, but also in the connection to to memorialization, right? Or memory culture.
Yes, it's about how art has often been used to abet authoritarianism, not necessarily to defeat it. We like to think of art as much more salubrious and critical, but there are many instances where the art has kind of failed to prevent anything of that nature. And so, since given the return of populist governments around the world, and certainly in the United States, the question was, how do we mobilize a critical memory that would strengthen and be a bulwark against authoritarian impulses?
That's such an important question, and it's not just for the art world. I think it's for academics as well, for anybody involved in public discourse and exchange, because there are of course so many examples, especially in Germany, with artists who made their careers in the 1930s, and then after 45 they all just hushed it up and reinvented themselves and were embraced as resistance fighters, and this is of course one of those questions: is does art have to be political, or can art be apolitical? We have one of the artworks that is part of this exhibition now in our center is by Emil Nolde, who was hailed as one of the most famous and most beloved post-45 artists in Germany. And last year there was a big exhibition finally contextualizing the fact that he was a Nazi and a member of the party, which was known before. And I think the problem is that we need to offer the context. We need to talk about these issues, and the point is that we always want things to be black and white, especially when it comes to injustice and to atrocity. So somebody is either a perpetrator or a victim, but most of the people are just in this huge gray zone in between, and it's very difficult to. I think it's possible, and it's done in many places, but not just to work with these black and white schemes and leave all the possibilities of participation, of responsibility out. And one of the things that I remember is we had a group of members of the American Congress coming to our center, and it was an interesting discussion. There were Democrats and Republicans, and I walked them through the exhibition, and there is as part of the historical exhibition that is just talking about the 1920s and about the problem that there's no solidarity in society anymore, and there's scapegoating, and people are isolated, and there's this sort of like growing extremes. And so one of the artworks that is in this part of the exhibition is by Diamond Stingley, a Chicago-based artist working on structural racism in the United States. And this sparked a discussion between these members of Congress whether there is a connection between what happened in Germany back then and what happens in the United States today, and in what ways you can talk about it. And of course, there were some Republicans that would say, oh no, the Nazis were monsters. You cannot compare them to anything. But of course, they were not monsters. No, perpetrators have families, they have friends, there may be good fathers, there may be good sons, they're just often just regular people. And I think it's really important, and I think that art is very helpful in showing these many, many shades that either in history or in the present situation that are there of people collaborating, making decisions to collaborate, or people making these small decisions of resistance, of saying no, of showing solidarity to someone who is weak in a situation or who needs support. And I think this is really important to show that, and I think art often does that and has the potential to do it, and that makes it already political.
Thank you, Miriam. Steph, you seem you have some thoughts.
Yeah, I do think that, I mean, the core of the question for me is, how do we strengthen the means to have collective memories? And I think that question is quite distinct from the question of how to strengthen the sort of mechanisms by which we construct collective ideologies. Ideologies are different than memories. And so memories, I think, are sort of less essentially judgmental. Ideologies tell us sort of the sort of social compartments in which we fit, whereas collective memories don't necessarily do that. They just construct a kind of folklore, a kind of story by which we can at least say that we belong generally together, right? And a nation is essentially that. It's just this story, this idea that someone who looks completely different from me, has a completely different set of experiences, nevertheless can be called US American. One of the ways I think that we can do that constructively is to actually do the really difficult work of thinking about what the quote unquote other side is doing. I just had a conversation this morning about this on a podcast I'm a member of. It's called The American Age. And we were arguing back and forth about the sort of adolescence of America in general, US America, and how that adolescence has come to the surface in responses to the pandemic. Part of the adolescence, we think, is that, and I think, is that it's very, very difficult now for me to listen to or give credence to the argument made by someone who supports the current president. My visceral reaction is to imagine that this person is an idiot and to turn away. And that's not criticality. I will be categorical in saying that. I need to find a way, and this is a struggle for me, but I need to find a way to understand whatever mythology they are coming from that makes it possible to see this person as a leader they want to emulate. Like there's something there. I'm not sure what they're seeing when they see children in cages, but maybe they see something different than I see. And I think that the temptation has been, for especially for people in the art scene, to become rather smug in their activism. And I own that. I've become rather smug in my quote unquote activism. And I'm saying quote unquote because I'm not out marching. I write mostly. I write and I edit. And that's where to try to bring my politics to bear. But in my activism, qualified as it is, I can be smug. And that is not a way to, that is not a way that's conducive, or not a method that's conducive to elaborating, establishing, cultivating collective memories. They have to be done. They have to be done in dialogue.
There's a couple of very good questions sent in anonymously that I'd like both of you and whoever you can volunteer to speak first. What repercussions do you anticipate for our collective memory from the intensified virtualization of so many of our interactions, relationships, and livelihoods in response to this global pandemic? Are there ways those of us in the practice of art and history should be preparing for how we will exist in what we do in the next pandemic?
The next pandemic, wow, okay.
Well, I think the first part of the question is a very, I think both questions are good, but the first part especially is we live in a very virtual world right now. And so what does that say in terms of collectivity and such?
Oh, I can answer briefly, and then Sam, if that's okay.
Please,
start.
Please.
I think on the one hand, it's it shows us that we can exist without flying every week to some place and we can still interact. And I think I experience a lot more interaction than, well, not more, but it's a different kind of interaction. It's easier to do something like we're doing right now, and we don't have to fly. And this will be an issue in the future too with climate change. If we all go back to our flying routines from before, then, you know, what the hell? Then we can just, it's our dance on the Titanic. So we have to adjust on the one hand. On the other hand, I think my experience right now, because in Germany, the situation is a little bit more relaxed than in the United States. And I see that people are cherishing actual meetings in a way that I did not expect that to happen.
Yeah.
You know, people are so glad just to have in-person meetings or an evening with friends or you know, an opening or whatever, you know, whatever was part of our regular life, we cherished that. And I think maybe this is also a good thing because we realize what are the important things, and the important things is maybe not consumerism, and the important thing is maybe not the, you know, the kind of success stories that we have been writing, experiencing, witnessing for many years and decades. But maybe it's about other things, and it's really about, you know, being so in a way yeah, happy and grateful about the actual exchange that you have with people, and whatever happens then, you know, in an actual conversation that is not on Zoom and not even on the phone, although phone conversations are, I agree, are in many ways much more intimate and more constructive. You know, I think that maybe we should really find ways of creating these moments of, you know, assembly, the moment we can again, and celebrate these venues and respect them.
Can you answer, rather, can you pose the question again to me, Ken? I just want to make sure I got it.
The question had to do with the intensified virtual environment that they're in, and the implications for collective thought, collectivized action, given that we're all socially, many of us are socially isolated, whether as individuals or as groups. And so what sort of implications are that in terms of possible active response to that's been exiged by the global pandemic?
Yeah, I think that one of the things that Miriam, one of the keywords that she used just a moment ago is key for me too, which is the idea of cherishing personal interaction. I think that it's been surprising, especially the conversation for me, and I identify as an introvert, and for people who also identify as introverts, conversations I've had around this with them have been, well, initially surprising and then really affirming. That I'm surprised by how much I could deeply crave human interaction, because I tend to be someone who recharges by myself. But the last 7 months have been really exhausting because I don't get that that hit of personal energy from somebody else being in the same room with me or across the table from me often enough. So I think one of the responses will be, and has been, as we shift the ways that we live and we shift our lifestyles, is I would like to think we will be motivated to cherish those rare moments of coming together, of being in the same room, of demonstrating together, speaking with one voice, of signing on to an agenda and saying, we believe this and we are working together to achieve this. I think I think there isn't enough artwork really ever made in that tone of celebration, and I want to see more of that. And I think that can happen. I think we're realizing, most of us profoundly now, how much we miss each other.
I agree.
Thank you, Steph. Miriam, Birgit Lagenscheid wrote, picking up on a remark by Dr. Zadoff, how can we involve pupils, students that is, in either retelling the past through art or to let them participate in creation and curating of exhibitions? They do not want only to listen, but they want to be a part and to create themselves. And I guess I would expand that to, it's really a question of how do we invoke and involve the active, genuine participation of new audiences within the process of art making and exhibition making.
Mm-hmm. So we had one experience, and it was, I think one of the things that is really important is one has to be or try experiments and don't be afraid to fail, because it's sometimes things work out and sometimes they don't. We had a cooperation with a school with students in Germany. Students go to school when they they become, it was a cohort of students, they become carpenters and I don't know, wall painters and all that, but they go to school also. So we worked together with them and we asked them to do an exhibition, an intervention into the historical exhibition in our center, and they prepared all sorts of little works, well, whatever, artworks, and they all had some message. They wanted to say something, and most of these students were, many of them were refugees or migrants who were not born in Germany, and who came to see this, historical exhibition on the German past, and then they developed artworks or works that were dealing with their fears, with their wishes for their future. It was about the fear of being poor. It was about racism. It was about memories from the places they came from, about injustice, and so on. And I think it was a wonderful little exhibition. And afterwards, it ran very well. And then a teacher came to me and he said, yeah, but they're not talking about National Socialism. And I said, why should they be talking about National Socialism? Dealing with this past, this is what it sparked in them, talking about social justice, about racism, about their voice in a democracy. And I think this is important. If you tell them they have to do something that deals with exactly that part of history, they will not contribute something. And so what we're trying to do is, we're trying to do now virtual projects to develop an app where students can contribute, they can upload things, but an app that also offers them, little, I don't know, gaming parts and so on, so that they're 13-year-olds start using this app at all or find it interesting, but that they can contribute something, and that this then contributes to our exhibition, that we collect material that will then be used in an exhibition we're doing. But I hopefully will manage to develop new ways and start more and more of those projects. I think that they are really crucial, especially with young people, because they're in a situation that they know exactly that their voices will never be heard. They will never be part of the public discourse. And so it's a moment where they can, where they can really sort of in the space of a museum, develop their own ideas and see that they can contribute. And, they can contribute in many ways. And it's not a given fact that just because you are becoming a carpenter, you don't have a voice. and I think that is really important, and hopefully we'll find ways of developing more of these kinds of projects.
Do you have anything to add, or I can ask another question?
Yeah, you can ask another question, Ken. I'm good.
Okay, Tome Arai asked, to return to James Baldwin's point that I made earlier about reckoning from within versus destruction. At this moment of racial and social reckoning, shouldn't we be looking at rebuilding our cultural institutions from the ground up, rather than to expect them to become more democratic in relationship to their communities? Yes, we should we should expect our institutions to be accountable to communities they claim to serve. But in reality, we are looking at an art world deeply indebted to wealthy donors and corporate interests who are awash in their investments in big pharma, cigarettes, tear gas, and real estate by sitting on museum boards and buying art. We face the deepest cynicism from both artists and arts practitioners whenever the question of changing the system arises. What are your thoughts about this? That should be an easy one, Seth.
Yeah, I mean, basically, Tome is, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, is questioning whether our sort of rhetorical commitment to making these institutions more democratic means anything when structurally they're still deeply indebted to wealthy donors and corporate interests who use museums basically to art wash their sometimes ill-gotten gains, mostly ill-gotten gains. God, I mean, the way I want to answer that, because I'm practical, is I want to say, well, then we need to cultivate wealthy donors or wealthy folks to support cultural institutions that don't do that. Like, can we find, are there people with, because I'm interrupting myself, because I realized that in going down this road, what I'm saying is, so here's the structure. I don't know how much we can actually change that fundamentally. So why don't we shift this bit of it and aim it towards sort of transparent, honest kind of philanthropic support? That's one answer. And I admit that it's kind of a what's the word, anemic one. But the temptation in this moment would be to say, well, why don't we just shift the thing entirely and make it so that museums are state supported? I would love that. I think that the model of cultural institutional support in the US is awful. It's just horrible. I mean, there's basically only the Smithsonian that gets federal dollars, essentially. But how would that be brought about? Like, I mean, you're talking about a fundamental shift in the ways that the government here relates to cultural institutions. And given the kind of ideology that the US is founded on, in very crude terms, white settler, manifest destiny ideology, this idea that the primary social unit is the white male, and he has the family around him as a kind of buffer between him and everyone else. That, because of that fundamental ideology, it's really hard to get the people who would have to be on board with that kind of change, i.e. senators and congressmen and the whole executive branch. Get them on, it'd be difficult to get them on board to completely shift the way we think about institutional support. I'm all for it. I think that people object to institutions being supported by the government because they say that the art becomes weaker and that people aren't as hungry and that people don't take as many risks. I don't know that any people need to take any more risks than they already do. Right. So I've sort of painted myself into a rhetorical corner. I think that the more fundamental shifts that would need to happen to make art museums and cultural institutions support in a very different way, I have no idea how to bring these about. I just don't know. And the sort of less robust response of saying, well, let's cultivate a group of donors who do give a damn about culture and do give a damn about telling the stories of marginalized folks. That's the best I can come up with.
Thank you, Seth. I think Tomei's question is also, it needs to be done. If not now, when? And Miriam, do you have thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, I think it's a crucial question right now because especially in the US, so many institutions are being threatened now through the pandemic, and the question is how can the US re-emerge from that crisis that will hit on so many levels. And of course, we're now experiencing this, the benefits of the European social welfare system. And nobody knows if this remains like that. If the crisis continues, we will feel it more. Yes, we have budget cuts, but we're still in a very, very good position. And one of the things that I've experienced and I've come to really appreciate it is that in museums here or in culture in general, you are invited to be critical, or you are expected to be critical of the political system. It's kind of written into the constitution in Germany that culture has to criticize the political establishment. And of course, this doesn't always happen, but it happens mostly. And I came from the university. I was as an academic, you enjoy this freedom anyhow, but in a cultural institution, it's very crucial, and especially when there is political change about that. If you're state funded, you are still free to criticize the current political system, and that is something that is of course threatened or already abolished in many places. For example, Poland, where most of the museum directors have been exchanged by the current political system and have to tell different story. Art museums, historical museums, and so on. So it's a very fragile. It's a very fragile system. Anyhow, if you're not state funded, you're more free in that sense. But on the other hand, you're dependent of donors. You're dependent of a capitalist system, which is usually very brutal and not very inclusive and not diverse either. So it's very difficult.
Thank you, Miriam. That's the end of our session. I feel like we're just kind of getting started, so time flies. And thank you I want to thank Dr. Miriam Saudoff and Dr. Seth Rodney for their insight, their perspicacity, their generosity of spirit, and I learned a lot just sitting here, and I know the audience member have as well. So thank you very much, and that concludes this session, and well, it concludes the town hall. So I guess it's back to Patricia or Paul. I'm not exactly sure. Thanks very much again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ken, Seth, Miriam. And thank you to all of today's speakers, moderators, and the 2020 fellows. That was a really great discussion, and I really appreciate the shout out to climate change, Miriam. A special thank you to all of our partners and supporters, especially the Surdna Foundation, the Goethe Institute, and BPB. Visit Goethe Institute's website, where you can find out more about the 20+ events, both in person and virtual, that will continue these conversations throughout the rest of the month. A big thank you to the Monument Lab team, especially our producers, Justin Geller, Jen McCleary, Matthew Callanan, Yannick Trapman O'Brien, and Christian Gianantonio, and of course, the inimitable Paul Farber. Also, thank you to the Goethe teams, the Goethe team, Elizabeth Schreiber-Briers, and all the interpreters. Really amazing work today. Follow us on social media at Monument Lab, at Goethe DC, and at BPB_DE for future programs. Thank you to you, our audience, for tuning in today, sending you thoughts of peace, and wishing you well today. Goodbye.